Hi there, this is Solitary Ronin from Solitary Ronin Films, and welcome to a very special video. This is my favourite 100 films currently, and I have had many stupid ideas in this channel, but this might be the most stupid. These films are ranked. It is a soft ranking, but I have ranked my favourite 100 films. Now obviously this is a little bit silly because you could easily have 350 films in your top 100. But for the sake of hilarity, I have ranked my favourite 100 films. Now there are certain groups, so this video is going to be number 100 to number 51, and I would say, again, this is a soft ranking, so there's fluid, it's fluid in this chunk. And then I would say 26 to 50 is another kind of chunk with certain markers at either end of that. And then 11 to 25 is another section, and then the top 10. But within all those sections, there's fluidity to that. More disclaimers. For me, you can't call something one of your favourite films of all time if you've only seen it once. So the minimum number of watches for the films in this list is 2. That's just because there's actually some films that I've only seen in the last couple of years. But the majority of these films I have seen over 10 times, 20 times, 30 times, 40 times. I wouldn't even like to think of a number higher than 40. But there are, certainly when you get nearer the top 10, there's films I have seen quite a lot of times. I think it's a fairly balanced list as far as myself being from an English language country. There are more English language films. I've tried to be as honest as possible. I've used mathematics, I've used algorithms, I've used the Arch-Stanton theory to try and rank these films. Now obviously if your favourite film isn't in my favourite 100, that's probably got more to say about me, because obviously there's lots of classic films I haven't seen. Once I've done the full rundown, I might actually put my list on Letterboxd, or make a Letterboxd list, so a certain member of the community can do a video slagging off my taste. Some people may say this list is fairly obvious and fairly mainstream, and it doesn't have enough 10-hour documentaries about Belgian cheese factories. But sometimes your favourite films aren't necessarily the greatest films ever made. There's plenty of examples in this 100. I mean, I'd be interested to see if people want me to have a go at my own version of the Sight and Sound greatest films. I do think that list doesn't really make a lot of sense, because they only ask people for their top 10 and then extrapolate it out to 100, whereas actually asking people for their top 100 would actually be a more accurate representation of the greatest films of all time, rather than just asking for 10. But I would certainly be up for trying to do what I think are the greatest 100. Now obviously they still have to be in my collection, and spoilers, there would still be no Hitchcock in my greatest, but I could objectively have a go if people would like to see that as well. Because obviously greatest and favourite aren't always the same. Obviously there's some overlapping, but obviously I can be objective and say quite a lot, and my favourites aren't necessarily the greatest films of all time. But again, that's why you need to have, you know, the clear difference between top, greatest and favourite. So enough of the yakking. Let's get on with it. You might as well settle in. And again, apologies if your favourite film isn't on this list. Again, it's just a bit of fun. But please do let me know your favourite 100 films ranked in order using mathematics algorithms and the Arch-Stanton method. So at number 100 is a film that I have only really seen in the last 2 years. So I've only seen it, I think, 3 times. But it was a stunner. It's Francesco Rossi's Uomini Contro, or Many Wars Ago, starring Gianmaria Volonté. This is one of my wonderful Italian discoveries that I've made in the last couple of years. I think it is now my favourite World War I film. I know favourite and World War I is a bit of an oxymoron. But it is absolutely wonderful. Does it have kind of cliches from war films? Yes, it does. But it doesn't really matter. It's set in the mountains of Italy. And it is just absolutely spectacularly good. One of Rossi's best, and that's saying something. So that's Many Wars Ago from 1970, which is just absolutely wonderful. Now the next film is proof, if proof be need be, that this is a favourite list, not the greatest 100. This is The Beast Must Die by Amicus. This film disturbed the hell out of me as a child. Obviously now it's not scary at all in any way, shape or form, but I was so happy when Indicator announced this release. Obviously Severin, Region A also has a release, but this Indicator release is far better than the Severin in my opinion. This is basically an Agatha Christie, but it's a werewolf. Calvin Lockhart, spectacular. The score is spectacular. It starts off almost as a kind of racist The Most Dangerous Game, but that's kind of flipped on its head as we find out Calvin Lockhart is actually the big game hunter searching the most dangerous game of all because he thinks one of his guests is a werewolf. Peter Cushing, I believe, is a Swedish professor whose accent goes a little bit up and down. You've got Charles Gray, the wonderful Charles Gray. You've got Anton Diffring as the technology expert. There's almost a pre-Aliens motion detector scene, which is wonderful. You've got a very young Michael Gambon, made in 1974, the year of my birth. It's absolutely wonderful. Is it flawed? Yes. The actual beast is a huge disappointment, but the ideas, the humour, the wonderful performance of Calvin Lockhart, the score, as I say, certainly for me it's well worth number 99. Obviously it wouldn't be a list from Saoirse Ronan if I didn't cheat. So for the next entry I'm definitely cheating because I'm just putting in the whole of the Baby Cart, Lone Wolf and Cub series. The first 3 are probably objectively the best, but I just love them all, so I'm pulling a cheat. for number 98. This is Sword of Vengeance, Baby Cart the River Styx, Baby Cart to Hades, Baby Cart in Peril, Baby Cart in Land of Demons, and White Heaven and Hell. If you love Arterial Spray, if you love the Red Groovy, the Baby Cart series is wonderful. Beautiful artwork by Criterion. So next is another film that is almost a new entry, if you like. But another film I've just blown away by. For years I thought a certain French film was the best version of this, but I've now changed my mind. It's The Virgin and the Monster, or Beauty and the Beast, by Uraj Hertz, who also did The Cremator and Morgiana, which I've done a random review of. It's a telling of Beauty and the Beast. It's absolutely magical, beautiful. The Beast is completely different from the usual manifestation of it. It's nightmare fuel. It's just absolutely wonderful. One of those films that I kind of knew within 10 minutes that I was absolutely going to love it. And I love it. Next, this probably used to be a lot higher. Blade Runner, or Eventually I'll Get It Right If You Give Me Enough Chances, by Ridley Scott. Responsible for a lot. You could argue whether that's good or bad. With wonderful Rutger Hauer. Harrison Ford hated making it, but it's one of his best performances. One of the few Hollywood meditations on existence, mortality, life itself. The Harrison Ford character isn't actually that interesting, it's the characters round about him that are more interesting. And obviously this and Alien are the two films that Ridley Scott has been living off for the last 40 years. Next is a criminally underrated film. I mean, this 100 will kind of show you, or will take you into my mind, which is obviously a very disturbing place. But next up is Roger Corman's The Man with the X-Ray Eyes. This is arguably Corman's best film, in my opinion. It's only 79 minutes long, but what it crams into the 79 minutes, the ideas, obviously the classic, you know, don't meddle in things that you shouldn't be meddling in. But it's not only does Ray Milland want to see through people's clothing, but he wants to go through more and more, see the universe itself, the heart of the universe, and he goes mad, and it has a wonderful ending. What's most depressing about this is on Second Sight's website, I think this is still available, the special edition. The limited edition for Second Sight titles usually go out of print pretty quickly. I think this was released about 4 years ago and it's still available. That's quite sad because everybody should have a copy of this in their collection. It's just so good. Next, in a similar vein, a film that for me is literally perfect. The 1954 Don Siegel Invasion of the Body Snatchers. Now a lot of people prefer the 1978 Philip Kaufman, which is an excellent film in itself. I have no complaints if you prefer the 78 version, but I just love Kevin McCarthy, and I just love this film. I can't remember the first time I saw it, but it's just so perfect. It doesn't hang about. It just rattles along brilliantly. It's got a great ending. Story told in flashback. Kevin McCarthy's big sweaty face. Absolutely wonderful. Been imitated so many times. But the original is still the best. For me anyway, but what do I know? Again, my opinion is not fact. Next, John Woo's The Killer. If you remember when John Woo was actually allowed to do John Woo things. Obviously came to Hollywood, and with the exception of Face Off, pretty much was never allowed to actually be John Woo. That classic Hollywood thing of, oh, we really love what you do, come over to Hollywood and we'll let you do it, but not quite the way you actually want to. I think Hard Boiled was the first John Woo film that I saw in the cinema, which was quite an experience, and then went back and watched The Killer, which is the better film. Obviously John Woo films have that hysterical, kind of emotional, but still strangely chaste. You know, all the men kiss the women on their foreheads, and obviously there's lots of homoerotic undertones to it. Chow Yun-fat has never been cooler. You know, if you show The Killer and Hard Boiled and Better Tomorrow 2 to somebody who likes Hollywood action films, they may be agog. But I remember The Killer had quite an impression on me when I was a lot younger. Next is almost a modern film. Kim Ji-woon's A Bittersweet Life. I mean, again, some people might say, well, it's just a surface film. But what surface? I just love the nihilism of it. The way the lead character is essentially trapped, there's nothing he can do about it. He is drawn towards his own destiny and his own death, and he looks stunningly good while he's doing it. It glistens and it glitters like a big shiny bullet, but it is quite moving. You're on the protagonist side throughout. I think Kim Ji-woon is the most underrated of the more famous Korean directors, if you want to call it that. And A Bittersweet Life is quite beautiful. Next is a good old-fashioned cynical Hollywood acidic love letter to fame itself. Sweet Smell of Success, Alexander McKendrick. It's just one of the greatest scripts ever written, ahead of its time in the underlying currents of darkness and perversity. Beautifully shot by James Wong Howe. Seminal performances by Curtis and Lancaster. And if this isn't on the list of the greatest American films of all time, it really should be. Next is Lawrence of Arabia. Again, this probably used to be higher. The second half's not as good as the first half, but if you watch this on the big screen or on the projector, as big screen as possible, they don't make films like this anymore. The idea that most of the cast were drunk while they made it. But again, I think, you know, there's an emotional reason for this as well. This is one of my dad's favourite films. He took his dad to see it when it came out, and that was in the cinema with a wraparound screen. You know, being locked in a cinema and a wraparound screen watching Lawrence of Arabia. It's 2 or 3 different films all within it. Yes, it's a big epic and you can just pay attention to the big epic, or it's a psychological study of a guy who was clearly a homosexual. Clearly there was some masochism, sadomasochism going on. He did pretty much kill himself. A story about building your own myth and trying to live up to your own myth. So I think the reason that it stays relevant to me is all the psychological undercurrents going on, or you can just pay no attention to that and just enjoy the spectacle. It just has some jaw-dropping shots in it. Again, I think it has kind of lost its luster a little bit, and that's probably reflected in where it is in the 100, but it's still a work of sheer impressive will to actually pull that off. Next, another modern film. This is incredible. Ensemble by Denis Villeneuve. This is the last foreign language or non-English language film that Villeneuve did, and what a film it is. And this is the Plain Archive, lovely edition, about a brother and a sister who, after the death of their mother, are tasked with finding the father they thought was dead and the brother that they never realised they had in a war-torn country. And it works in flashbacks to their mother's story when she was a younger woman and their story of discovering their family. Villeneuve just seamlessly goes back and forward through time without the usual graphics we see up on the screen in most films about flipping from time to time. It's very fluid, and when the crunch comes, it's very crunchy. It does ask a big mathematical question. It's an absolute stunner. I know there'll be people who will say, oh yeah, I knew what was going to happen anyway, but personally for me, I'm just gripped by the story and the characters, and you don't see the sledgehammer coming. Next, again, this is obviously my favourite 100, and this again is one of the more odd little films in my favourite 100. And this is Tom Stoppard's Rosencrantz and Guildenstern Are Dead, the only film that the playwright directed based on his play, based on the two supporting characters from Hamlet, featuring almost career best performances by Gary Oldman and Tim Roth. Originally they were going to have Sean Connery as the leader of the players, but got Richard Dreyfuss, who's absolutely fine, and Ian Glenn is wonderful as Hamlet. So these two buffoons basically drift in and out of Hamlet while Hamlet's going on in the background, and they get into their own little adventures, but in the end you actually feel for them because they have no idea what's going on and their place in the story. As we know, it all turns out like a bloodbath at the end, and again you actually feel for Rosencrantz and Guildenstern. It's just so good, full of so many wonderful scenes that obviously are fairly wordy just because it's Tom Stoppard, but it's an absolute little gem from 1990. I remember Barry Norman talking about it in Film 90, and I was just intrigued, and I have loved it ever since. Next, again, I do love this film, but you could almost argue I love what it represents even more. It's Pather Panchali by Satyajit Ray, 1955. This is my first Ray film for a man with no cinematic training. His eye for just simple but effective compositions, the use of nature. Also, this was his debut, so the symbol of the train, which runs through these films, that clash between the old world and the new world, Bengali language and English language, technology and tradition and superstition. It's just a beautiful film. Even though it's in black and white, you can almost just smell the colour of the Indian countryside. Shows you a world that certainly for those of us in the West are just unfamiliar with. But Rai at the end of the day shows us that we're all pretty much the same regardless of where we're from. We all have the same hopes and fears, the same issues and problems with family and friends. And it's just a beautiful little film. Next, Nicholas Ray's On Dangerous Ground. This was butchered and messed around with, but very much like Orson Welles' Magnificent Ambersons, What Remains is still a fantastic little film, even if it's just 82 minutes long. This is from 1952. Robert Ryan essentially plays like a Dirty Harry character who likes to beat up suspects and witnesses and pretty much anybody. And after the latest episode of this, he's pretty much punted up north to investigate a murder, and that's where he meets Ida Lupino, who is blind, as they're searching for a murderer. It's just a beautiful film. It's not as if Robert Ryan suddenly becomes a saint or anything, but there's just something quite beautiful about it. There's a wonderful understated Nicholas Ray way of showing the characters. You know, his partner, he goes to pick up his partner. We see Robert Ryan, you know, he's got a tiny little kitchen. He obviously lives with himself, pretty much just has a coffee in the morning and that's him. He goes to his partner's house. He's obviously got a wife and kids and a kind of full breakfast, and it's just simply done to show the difference between the two men. Ryan's always on edge and about to explode, but getting him out of the city to the trees and the countryside, there is just something wonderful about that. I guess it's like seeing a big cat in a zoo compared with seeing it out in the jungle. So even in its messed about with cut up version, it's just a wonderful film. You know, again, are there better Nicholas Ray films? Probably, objectively, but I've always absolutely adored On Dangerous Ground. Next, another film that has probably fallen a bit, but every time you watch it you just realise how fantastic it is. 12 Angry Men, which apparently is going to get a 4K quite soon. Sidney Lumet's debut, and this is, I mean, there's another film on this list, but this is a textbook of how to shoot basically 12 people in a room, but making the setups and the compositions still dynamic and riveting, the relationship of the characters between each other. It's one of the best scripts ever written. Yes, there's stuff that's a bit unbelievable, like Henry Fonda bringing a knife in, not to a gunfight but to a jury room. The characters are just fantastic. It's brilliantly acted. Ironically, the 1997 remake, the TV one, you could argue has a better cast, pound for pound. I mean, it's got Jack Lemmon, George C. Scott, McCletty Williamson, Edward James Olmos, James Gandolfini, William Peterson. I mean, it's just got a ridiculous cast, but somehow it's pretty much the same script, but it's just not as good as the original. It's just a wonderful script with those 4 or 5 just absolute mic drops. Because I've always looked at it as, well, what if Henry Fonda was actually on the take and he was paid to get the defendant off, and he's just manipulated the room to actually get yeah, that's just me. 12 Angry Men from 1957. There's a reason it's a classic. Again, this is another one from the 21st century. I don't quite know what's going on. It's a Guillermo del Toro film as well. Unbelievable. It is, of course, The Devil's Backbone. For me, his finest film, not Pan's Labyrinth. I mean, I like Pan's Labyrinth, but Pan's Labyrinth to me is nothing close to The Devil's Backbone. Just absolutely beautiful, lyrical little ghost story, which is more about the Spanish Civil War than it actually is about ghosts. A wonderful performance by Federico Lupi as the old doctor at the establishment. More of him later. Just an absolutely beautiful film. You wish Del Toro had actually made more Spanish language films rather than Hollywood films, but never mind. The Devil's Backbone is just absolutely ravishingly beautiful. Next, again, a film that I've only really seen the last few years, but I've already watched it probably 4 or 5 times. It's my favourite Joseph Losey, or my favourite Jolo film, as he's known in the business. Not sure by who. Mr. Klein by Alain Delon, or with Alain Delon, and Jean Moreau turns up as well. This is just a wonderful little doppelganger story, loosely based around the famous Paris roundup, where the French police pretty much helped round up a lot of Jews for the Nazis to go to very horrible, terrible places. And the beauty of this film, apart from the fact that it looks a little bit like a Melville film, Delon's slightly older performance, not quite as perfectly beautiful as he was as a younger man. He's unaware of the danger that he's in when he is kind of confused by a Jewish man called Mr. Klein, and he's too busy trying to clear his name. He doesn't kind of realise the impending doom that he's facing. It's just a beautiful, melancholy, twisted little film, and the ending is absolute dynamite. That's Mr. Klein. And then a film that, I mean, a lot of my favourite films I saw late night in BBC Two in my youth. And this was another one, Les Yeux Sans Visage by Georges Franju, Eyes Without a Face, just poetic. But it is a story about a surgeon whose daughter loses her face in a car accident, and he and the wonderful Lida Valley kill young women to try and replace his daughter's face. It has a classic, they're not going to show that, are they? And they do. Moment. It shouldn't work, the mix of horror and psychopathy mixed with just pure poetry. Les Yeux Sans Visage, if you watch it late at night and your mind is wandering, you will enter the dream or a nightmare. Speaking of nightmares, again, first time you see this film, you don't forget it. I think this might have actually been late night on Channel 4. I saw this for the first time. Georges Sluget's The Vanishing, obviously the Dutch original, not the Jeff Bridges, Kiefer Sutherland remake that Sluget directed himself, with a different ending. This is one of the most devastating endings of all time. One of the most matter of fact, kind of psychopath films. The cover is interesting if you look hard enough. Again, it's the fact that it's just so matter of fact. Again, I'm not going to talk about it too much if you haven't seen it, but you really should have seen it by now, from 1988, about how far you would go to actually find the truth about what happened to somebody that you cared about. Just an absolute stunner, as was this. Another film that I have only seen in the past few years, but I have rewatched it probably far too many times. Manila and the Claws of Light from 1975, your classic country boy comes to the city, in this case Manila in the Philippines, gets absolutely brutalised by the city, chewed out and spat out, exploited, and goes from one pretty much terrible ordeal to the next, with the inevitable ending. It's an absolute stunning piece of work by Lino Brocca, and this is a fantastic Criterion Region A. I do have a BFI release of it as well, which has another film with it, which perhaps isn't as jaw-droppingly good as Manila and the Claws of Light, but this is an absolute stunner. Yeah, it's an absolute stunner. Next, again, perhaps completely predictable, but again, I've never claimed not to be predictable. La Diabolique, or everything that Hitchcock wanted to be. Sorry, Hitchcock did want to film this himself, but Clouseau beat him to it even. This is just so misanthropically wonderful, and again, I've probably seen this 15-20 times. In the last 15 minutes, still increases my heartbeat, and I know exactly what's going to happen. That's wonderful storytelling, that's wonderful cinematic technique. Everybody knows what it's about, but the execution of it is just spectacular. One of the nastiest characters in cinema history. That is a straight up masterpiece. It might be predictable that it's in this list, but there's a reason, because it's spiffing. Next, again, another relatively new film to me. I have banged on about this countless times, not just for the title. It's Francesco Rossi again, and it's Illustrious Corpses with Lino Ventura from 1976, co-starring Max von Sydow. Again, this is a jaw-dropper. If I tell you it's a 70s film, you know what that means. About judges that start being assassinated, and Lino Ventura is investigating the case. It's just absolutely beautiful, absolutely terrible, and of course has a 70s ending. Next, it's Johnny Guitar. Nicholas Ray with his second entry in the list. What can you say about Johnny Guitar that hasn't been said already? It's a yellow box. Joan Crawford in pure Joan Crawford, Mercedes McCambridge, and Sterling Hayden as the woman caught between the two men. It's just phenomenal, hysterical, technicolor masterwork, and quite fabulous. Now again, I do sound like a broken record. It's another Italian film that I've only recently seen in the last couple of years, but I've already devoured it quite a few times. It's Elio Petri's Investigation of a Citizen Above Suspicion. or Reverse Joseph K from 1970. Wonderful Ennio Morricone soundtrack. This is Region B, so if you're in the UK or the US, you have no excuse. About a police chief played by Gian Maria Volonté. No coincidence, but there does seem to be quite a few Volontés in this favourite 100. As a police chief who, instead of trying to plead his innocence, wants to plead his guilt, but in a satire of the years of lead, that's a little bit more complicated than it would first seem. Just looks absolutely beautiful, sounds beautiful, great performance by Volonté, and sadly Petrie, another one of these directors that went way too early. Next, my favourite Claude Chabrol, probably will always be my favourite Claude Chabrol, Le Boucher. As I've said before, it's wonderful that Arrow Video released the 2 Blu-ray box sets of some of Chabrol's later work, but it'd be really good if they could release the 1968 to 1973 or 4 works like The Man Must Die and Breach, and of course Le Boucher. I mean, to me, Le Boucher really sums up Chabrol. It's set in the country rather than the city. It's about the relationship of a school teacher and Le Boucher, the butcher. It's about our relationship to butchery, murder, war, how that all fits in. It's about redemption. It's about the most nervous cherry eating scene in cinema history. Stéphane Audran, who would marry Chabrol and appear in lots of his films, has never been more radiant or elegant as the school teacher. It's just a beautiful pastoral film, but obviously has darkness underneath, as quite a lot of Chabrol films are. We get to know the characters, we get to know the community, how the community works, as we do in most of Chabrol films. It's a slow burn, but it's a beautiful burn, and what a wonderful way to go. Next, again, fans of this director might say, well, this is one of the obvious picks, but sometimes the obvious picks are just because they're really good. This is Bresson's L'Argent, a film I watched a couple of times a long time ago, and then watching it again when the BFI were lovely enough to release this on Blu-ray. I've since watched it multiple times as well. Bresson's last film, but at that point, well, before this, obviously, he'd kind of honed his talent to get down to the nitty-gritty, the essentials, and this is just profound, moving, about a simple act and the domino effect that that simple act can have, the lives that are destroyed by it. It's got a beautiful ending, the way it's shot as well, the lamp against the wall. It's one of my favourite lamps against the wall scenes in cinema history. So that's L'Argent by Robert Bresson. Next is another Italian film. It's The Organizer by Mario Monicelli, starring Marcello Mastroianni. And one of his less Marcello Mastroianni. Again, he's an actor that I have kind of learned to appreciate a bit more the last couple of years, because again, I just had this image of him, very much like Volonté. I had a kind of stock image of him, but this, he's scruffy and a bit of a bum as he goes around from town to town trying to organise unions. This has everything. It'll make you laugh, it'll make you cry, it'll make you go to the toilet. It's just a wonderful film about community. Again, a lot of Italian films are about the north-south divide. This one's no different as well. All the characters are fully rounded, and when the brutality kicks in, it knocks you for an absolute loop, and then you realise, alright, it's because I've actually cared so much about the characters. Maybe there's a clue in there for writers. Maybe you should actually write characters that people care about. And up next is the first John Sayles film. Obviously, people would know there'll be some John Sayles. This is Men with Guns, his Spanish language film. It's funny because the organiser was pretty much recommended by John Sayles in his Criterion cupboard visit. He picked out the organiser. So Men with Guns is one up from that. Obviously this is a soft ranking. This is a road film. Again, this is Federico Lupi as a doctor, a privileged doctor. I mean, the first scene of the film, we literally see the doctor with his finger up the arse of a general. Obviously doing a proctology exam, not just for personal enjoyment. And Lupi, as I say, he is not a celebrity doctor, but he's well off, and he hears this story about one of his students who may have been killed out in the country, because the country, even though it's unnamed, has a kind of civil war. So he goes out into the country and realises that pretty much all of his trainee doctors have been killed, and he goes deeper and deeper into the countryside, and he comes across, as you do in road movies, he comes across characters who have their own stories to tell, as usual with Sayles, all about the characters. It's absolutely beautiful, and it has a transcendental ending that's also quite beautiful, because again, it's one of those, you can't take the knowledge back with you. And this was made as a response to getting an Oscar nomination for Lone Star. John Sayles came back and did a Spanish language film. Next is Blue Collar, another debut, this time by Paul Schrader. I think this film, made in 1978, is still relevant, it'll always be relevant, and it's basically how companies set their workers against each other rather than against the companies. Divide and conquer. This is noisy, it's very sweary, it's in your face, it's argumentative. Great performances by Richard Pryor, Harvey Keitel and Yaphet Kotto. How Schrader managed to corral them all is a story in itself. Great score, wonderful ending which is completely truthful, and again, it is a film that will always be relevant. And this was one of the earliest Indicator titles that I got and fell in love with Indicator. Yeah, I mean, 100 years from now, we'll still be talking about Blue Collar. That's how good it is. Next, I'm not going to pronounce the Swedish. It's Through a Glass Darkly by Ingmar Bergman. Obviously I could have had quite a lot of Bergmans, but Through a Glass Darkly, because to me one of the most underrated things about Bergman is his cinematography, how his films look. His shot composition is really underrated. Everybody talks about the ideas and the scripts, but how he actually shoots his films, this is basically 4 characters in the film. But again, there's always a dynamic camera at work. This is just a beautiful, beautiful film about mental illness. Of course, Björnar Gunnar Bjornstrand and Harry Anderson are wonderful, and Max von Sydow. Just a beautiful, scary, dark little film, but just beautifully mounted. Again, a really underrated part of Bergman cinema is how good these films actually look. Next, blimey, it's another modern film. What's going on? It's 2 Days, One Night by the Dardennes. To me, this is their finest work. Marianne Cotillard is absolutely fantastic. It's a simple story, like most of the Dardenne films are. It's simply a woman who's coming back from being off sick from work, and she's told she can have her job back, but the other workers won't get their bonus. And she spends the weekend trying to convince the other workers to let her come back, but that means sacrificing their bonus. Again, such a simple story, but it's just done so beautifully in the Dardenne style, which again you probably either like or you really don't like. But for me, this is obviously, it'll always be relevant, and it's especially relevant nowadays, in the times that we live in. But it's an extremely humane film. Everybody's got their own reasons for their decision, whatever that decision is. And it's another film about workers against bosses, and it's just beautiful. Where are we? Well, I talked about Blue Collar being a film that kind of got me into Indicator, or one of the films that got me into Indicator. Well, here's the film that got me into Imprint. The Gambler, arguably my second favourite American film of the 70s. We'll probably get to my favourite American film of the 70s. This for me is perhaps James Caan's finest performance. Strangely enough, as a gambler, it's a wonderful philosophical film. You know, it's not about the winning, it's actually about the losing. He comes from a rich background. He's a college professor who teaches English. It's just so good. I mean, that's not the greatest description of The Gambler, but it's just wonderful. And again, when Imprint released the Blu-ray, it was just, I have to get that, because that's again one of those holy grail films getting a Blu-ray release. The Great Silence by Sergio Corbucci, who did Django, but this is way better than Django. This is an unusual Western, to say the least. Again, the first time I saw this, I think it was late night on BBC Two. Common theme, an Ennio Morricone soundtrack, a Western set in the snow. Klaus Kinski, Jean-Louis Trintignant, who at that point I think I'd known him from Three Colours Red. The hero is mute. I mean, it's one of the oddest, greatest westerns ever made, based on a true story apparently. Maybe not about the Great Silence, but the kind of time it was set in and what was going on. Klaus Kinski is a nasty bounty hunter who would prefer to kill people and bring them back rather than actually round them up. Again, it's just really odd, the fact that the hero doesn't speak. It's got one of the greatest endings. I've said that about a few of these films, but The Great Silence has got one of the best endings of all time, one of the best Klaus Kinski performances. Wonderful score by Morricone, and it's in the snow. What more could you possibly want from a Western? Next, again, this might be kind of a world cinema staple, but there's a reason for it, because it's a masterpiece, and that's Sancho Deo, or Sancho the Bailiff from Mizoguchi, from 1954. It's so wonderfully bleak. I love a film that's happy-go-lucky, and Sancho Deo is certainly not that. But it's horrible, but it's also beautiful. The ending is fantastic. Again, I've just said it again. But endings are important, and the ending of Sancho the Bailiff is absolutely wonderful. You get a real sense of the horrors that people went through in the good old days. Beautifully shot, well worth getting on Blu-ray, and just a mighty piece of work. Next, another DVD, can you believe it? It's Citizen X, a film that I have loved for many a year. This is an HBO TV movie, so unfortunately we'll probably never see it on Blu-ray. With Stephen Ray, Max von Sydow, Joss Ackland in a really subtle performance, Donald Sutherland. It's based on, sadly, the true story of Russia's first serial killer, Chikatilo, who I actually remember seeing on BBC News in his glass cage when he was in court. Again, you have Western actors being Russian, so you have to obviously just take that as it comes. It has that HBO TV look of the early 90s. It looks like a TV movie, but blimey, it's just so fantastic. When you kind of learn what kind of really happened and how easy it was for this guy to murder lots and lots and lots of children and young people. It's just a wonderful film, and Max von Sydow, who's not actually in it that long, he just turns up as a psychologist who helps give them a profile. He just steals the show, as he's prone to do. Next, Touch of Evil by Orson Welles. It might not be Welles' greatest film, but you could argue it's Welles' greatest collection of moments and profound dialogue. He even sneaks Marlene Dietrich in a cameo. He's fantastic in one of his king roles as Hank Quinlan. I'm saying it again. Got a brilliant ending, and just an absolutely fantastic piece of work. Because again, you could be strange and say, well, you kind of maybe didn't invent film noir with Citizen Kane, but certainly invented something with Citizen Kane, and then drove the nail into the coffin of film noir with Touch of Evil. Next, Doctor Strangelove. As you can see, this is on 4K. I didn't think the 4K of Doctor Strangelove would be that good, just because, you know, those location shots or kind of newsreel shots of the attack on the base. But it does actually look really good. And the 4K does have separate special features from the Blu-ray release. Just wonderful. Again, Kubrick fans may say, oh, this is not his best, but it's literally perfect. Certainly his funniest, George C. Scott, who obviously I'm not a huge fan of, even though I've got a lot of his films, is just absolutely wonderful. And Sellers is fantastic. And again, what an ending. Much better than a custard pie fight. Next, it's another sales. It's Matewan from 1987. Finally getting some recognition by being released in Criterion This is the 88 Films release. Just absolutely beautiful for the money that was made. It looks like old yellowing photographs. Stunningly shot by Axel Wexler. Great performance by Chris Cooper in his first film. James Earl Jones, David Strathairn, sales regular, based on a true story. Again, about unions and workers against the company. It's just absolutely beautiful. That's all I'm saying, because I've talked about Mate Wan quite a bit in this channel. Next, again, it might be an obvious choice, but it's Aguirre Wrath of God. Again, as I said in my director list, I really need to re-watch Herzog, but this and his remake of Nosferatu, the Vampire, are the ones that I watch on a regular basis. There's just something zen-like and dreamlike about this film. It is almost like a documentary. You feel as though you've entered a completely different world when you watch Aguirre Wrath of God. It is almost like a transcendental operation. Next, another Orson Welles, perhaps not everybody's favourite, but The Trial. Of course, I recently bought this Studio Canal remaster, and that was before I went 4K, so I'll probably trade this in and go 4K, because you've got to have Orson Welles in 4K. One of the masters of shot composition. I just love the absurdity of this. Anthony Perkins is fantastic. Some of the shots are just absolutely ridiculous, as in most of Orson Welles' films. The introduction is just so good. I think I've possibly watched that introduction. I mean, I had it typed out when I was younger. I had it typed out on A4 on my door in my bedroom in the old days. I just love that intro. I've probably watched that intro about 100 times. But just a wonderful, wonderful film. Again, perhaps not everybody's favourite Orson Welles film, but it's just so good. Next, it's Orlando. Sally Potter's Orlando. This is in 4K and it looks gorgeous. Tilda Swinton's greatest performance. It's absolutely ravishing. About a character who starts as a man, changes into a woman over the space of 400 years, not for any real reason. It's just absolutely sumptuous, and Tilda Swinton breaking the fourth wall, just looking at the camera at times, is just absolutely fantastic. It's just so good. Kind of run out of superlatives for it. It's just really, really wonderful. Next is Clue. I know this film has its knockers, but Tim Curry in one of his greatest performances as the butler. Just an all-star cast. This was panned when it came out, but it's great to see. It's only taken almost 40 years for people to actually appreciate it as the work of genius that it is. I literally could watch Clue every night for the rest of my life and never get bored by it. It's just so good. And after Clue, what are you going to do to relax? Well, you might as well watch Dead Ringers by Cronenberg. This makes a wonderful double bill with Clue. You know, this was Cronenberg suddenly kind of becoming a little bit more classy and elegant. But obviously he still had to insert strange gynecological tools. This is heartbreaking. A wonderful performance by Jeremy Irons and his brother Dave Irons. You can really tell that they're twins, and Genevieve Bujold caught in between. It's just masterly, for all those people who just thought, Cronenberg was about blood and guts and the horror stuff early on. This would lead to things like Crash and Crimes of the Future, that intelligence and elegance, not that obviously his earlier films didn't have intelligence, but just an elegance to it. It's just absolutely beautiful. It moves at that stately Cronenberg pace, and it's one of his masterworks. Next, I think this is possibly my highest ranked modern film. It's The Lobster by Lanthimos. This blew me away. It was just the right tone for me, the right wavelength, brutal and funny and strange, but completely believable. The perfect anecdote and the perfect antidote for Tinder dating. It was just revelatory. I think I had seen Dogtooth before I saw this, but this was just another level. And again, I have high hopes for Lanthimos. I've told him that countless times. But The Lobster is just tremendous. Again, from The Lobster, go to Kiru. I didn't actually realise Bill Nye, there's been a remake of this with Bill Nye, which obviously I haven't seen. It's supposed to be really good. This is from 1953, 1952 even. And what makes this so good is we've all done it. Somebody dies and you say, oh, I'm going to change my life. I'm going to do things differently from now on. This has really been a wake-up call. I'm not going to take it anymore. I'm going to do what I want. I'm going to live my dreams. And then it's just back to routine. It's heartbreaking. Shimura is just next level. People could be cynical and say, oh, it's really sentimental, but I don't think it is. It's wonderful. It's obviously a lot quieter than quite a lot of Kurosawa's more famous films, but it's wonderful. Next, Peeping Tom. Again, it's one of those films that you have a time in your life where you haven't seen Peeping Tom, and then a time in your life that you have seen Peeping Tom. Again, released in the same year as Psycho. I know which one is the perfect masterpiece, and it ain't the one with the shower. The fact that Michael Powell is the overbearing father is a lovely touch. Yes, some of the dialogue is aged. It'll be £2, but the heart of it, the fact that it's actually a statement on cinema itself and the camera, is just absolutely brilliant. And of course the sympathetic killer, which obviously got it into some hot water. It's absolutely sensational. Yes, again, parts of it have aged, but parts of it are still magnificent. Speaking of magnificent, The Red Shoes, this is the 4K You know, at the start, I wasn't that convinced with the 4K red shoes, I'll be honest. But then, at some point, after about 15 minutes, it kicked in, and my eyes fell out, and then I had to put them back in again. It was funny because when I was thinking about this list, I thought I wasn't actually going to put this in, because very much like A Matter of Life and Death, it's a tremendous film, but it's not actually in like my top 5 favourite Powell and Pressburger films. But then I watched it in 4K, and it kind of had to go in here. For me, it's like the greatest film ever made about creativity and art and the sacrifices you make for art. Not that I know what that's about. So it kind of had to go in. Not that I'm like, I feel bad about putting it in. But again, to me, it's the strength of Powell and Pressburger, because the films you don't watch that often. Not that I don't watch the Red Shoes often, but stuff like I Know Where I'm Going or A Canterbury Tale, you know, you don't watch them for a while, and then you watch them and you go, my goodness, that's the best film I've watched all month or all year. So the Red Shoes demanded to go in, especially in the 4K. Not that it's, again, not as a surprise it's in the top 100 or favourite 100. Blimey, it's good. I know that will come as a terrible surprise to everybody. Next, it's another Kurosawa, Ho Hum Ho Hum. It's just Throne of Blood, which is magnificent. Again, Kurosawa's use of wind and rain and fog. Mifune going full kabuki. Isuzu Yamada going full psycho as his wife. Just absolutely beautiful. Again, a scene that really sums up Kurosawa's power is when they're lost in the fog and they're riding about and their horses getting more and more frustrated, and as an audience you get more and more frustrated. Again, a wonderful ending, wonderful use of slow motion, just a tremendous, loud, noisy, scary piece of work. And then finally, at number 51, thanks very much for staying awake if you have. We're finally here at 51, and it's another Powell and Pressburger film, but this is a favourites 100, obviously, not the greatest, so I would probably bet that this Powell and Pressburger film will never be in Sight and Sound's 100 list, never be in Sight and Sound's 250 list, might never be in Sight and Sound's 500. But Sight and Sound is wrong. It's The Spy in Black. Can we get a Blu-ray of this, please? BFI did a wonderful job and one of our aircraft is missing. Can we please get Spy in Black? I love this film so much. Conrad Veidt, who I love so much, as a Nazi trying to destroy the British fleet in Scotland, and you want him to win. It's the genius of Pressburger's writing. You feel sorry for Conrad Veidt when things don't work out. Spoiler alert. Valerie Hobson is absolutely fantastic in it. Marius Goring's in it as well. But I just love The Spy in Black so much. Again, this is favourites, not the greatest. But by jingo, this is great. Because again, it's that complexity of Pressburger's writing. The fact that Veidt isn't just a cardboard cutout German villain. You actually feel sorry for him when it doesn't work out. You're rooting for him to sink the British fleet. Or maybe that's just me, I don't know. So that's number 51. I hope you've kind of enjoyed this video and you're not bemused by my choices. again, please let me know what your favourite 51 to 100 films are, and hopefully you'll join me again for part 2, which is the top 50, or my favourite 50, not the greatest 50. Let's put an end to that rumour right now. Thanks so much for watching. Hopefully that wasn't too much of an ordeal for you, and you still have the will to join me for number 50 to number 1. And yes, they are ranked in a soft focus kind of ranking, but they are ranked. So thanks very much for watching. This is Soldier Ronan from Soldier Ronan Films saying cheerio.